Under the dim, flickering light of a campfire, Zoktar sat among the young soldiers, his leathery skin reflecting a lifetime of battles fought across countless star systems. His eyes, dark pools of wisdom and sorrow, scanned the eager faces before him. They were restless, fresh from their first skirmishes, still carrying the arrogance of their species' superiority. Zoktar let out a gravelly chuckle, his tusks catching the light. "You think you've seen everything, don't you?" he began, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 stories. "Let me tell you of a being who changed the way I see this universe, a creature from a Deathworld. A human." The soldiers exchanged doubtful glances, their antennae twitching with curiosity. A few muttered under their breath about Deathworld myths, dismissing them as exaggerations. But Zoktar's tone silenced them. "Humans," he said, letting the word hang in the air. "Fragile, small, short-lived, or so I thought. Until I met one." The fire crackled as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You've all heard of Deathworlds, yes? Planets so hostile, they seem uninhabitable. Earth is one of them, a Class 7 Deathworld." The younger soldiers shifted uneasily. Class 7 was a designation they associated with worlds where survival was a statistical improbability. Zoktar continued, his voice steady and authoritative. "Imagine a planet where the air itself can kill you if you breathe it wrong. Where predators lurk in every shadow, and the weather can tear flesh from bone. That's Earth. A world where survival means constant adaptation, relentless willpower, and unyielding tenacity. And humans? They don't just survive there, they thrive." Skepticism flickered in the soldiers' eyes. One finally spoke, his tone hesitant. "Surely, if such a place existed, no intelligent life could evolve there. They'd be too preoccupied with staying alive." Zoktar's laugh was sharp, almost bitter. "Exactly. That's what makes humans remarkable. Their existence defies reason. They are born into chaos and forge order through sheer determination. Their planet didn't mold them to endure hardship, it bred them to overcome it." The campfire popped, and silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of their encampment's perimeter shields. Zoktar looked down, his claws tracing the scars etched into his armor. "I met one during a campaign against the YRRKX, a species as cunning as they are cruel. We were pinned down, outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of hope. When the human arrived, I was unimpressed. Small, fragile, unarmored, with weapons that looked laughably primitive by our standards. I remember thinking, this creature won't last a cycle." He paused, his eyes distant, as if reliving the memory. The younger soldiers leaned in, their earlier doubt replaced with fascination. "But what I witnessed," Zoktar continued, his voice thick with reverence, "shattered everything I believed about strength and survival. Humans are not strong because they are fearless. They are strong because they know fear better than any other species, and they face it anyway." His gaze swept across the circle of soldiers, now hanging on his every word. "Listen closely," he said, his voice firm. "If you think you understand war, strategy, or survival, wait until you've seen a human in action. They don't fight like us. They fight like Deathworlders, because that's what they are." The fire flared as if punctuating his words, and Zoktar leaned back, allowing the weight of his story to settle over his audience. The younger soldiers sat in rapt silence, their earlier bravado replaced with an unmistakable sense of awe. They were ready to hear more. The memory of that battlefield was seared into Zoktar's mind, a cacophony of desperation and chaos that no warrior could forget. The planet, a barren wasteland, offered little shelter and less hope. His unit had been holding their position for 3 rotations, surrounded by the relentless YRRKX forces. Supplies were dwindling. Morale was even lower. The horizon burned with the glow of enemy artillery, and the air was thick with the acrid stench of scorched earth and wounded soldiers. Zoktar's squad had resigned themselves to their fate. The YRRKX were known for their ruthless precision, and no reinforcements were expected. His soldiers, battered and weary, exchanged silent glances, each one preparing for the inevitable end. Yet, Zoktar, as their leader, could not allow despair to take root. He barked orders, demanded vigilance, and maintained the illusion of control, though in his heart, he knew they were delaying the inevitable. Then, through the haze of smoke and fire, a figure emerged. At first, Zoktar thought it a hallucination, a cruel trick played by his overtaxed mind. But as the figure approached, it became clear, this was no phantom. It was a human soldier. The human's appearance was almost laughably mundane. He was smaller than any member of Zoktar's species, clad in armor that seemed primitive by comparison. His face was exposed, revealing a calm expression that struck Zoktar as absurdly out of place. He moved with a purpose that belied the chaos surrounding him, stepping through the debris with an almost casual confidence. The human introduced himself as Lieutenant James, his voice steady and unwavering despite the situation. Zoktar's initial reaction was a mixture of disbelief and irritation. This creature, with his frail body and minimalist gear, had no business being here. Yet, there was something in his demeanor, a quiet authority that demanded attention. James quickly assessed the situation, his sharp eyes scanning the battlefield as though piecing together a puzzle only he could see. Zoktar watched, baffled, as James knelt to examine the terrain, running his hands over the cracked soil and studying the flora that stubbornly clung to life in this inhospitable place. "What's he doing?" one of Zoktar's soldiers muttered, the disdain in his voice unmistakable. Zoktar had no answer. James stood and turned to the group, his voice calm yet commanding. "I've fought in worse places," he said, as though that was supposed to be comforting. He began issuing orders, and to Zoktar's astonishment, his soldiers obeyed without hesitation. Perhaps it was the desperation of their situation, or perhaps it was the sheer conviction in James's voice. Either way, they followed his lead. The first of James's tactics was almost laughably simple: traps. Using the local flora, James fashioned snares and barriers with an efficiency that seemed almost instinctive. The YRRKX, and used to such crude methods of warfare, fell victim to them repeatedly. What Zoktar had dismissed as weeds and worthless undergrowth became tools of survival in the hands of this strange human. But it wasn't just the traps that impressed Zoktar, it was the way James utilized the environment itself. The planet's harsh winds, which had been their bane for days, became an asset under James's guidance. He used the gusts to obscure their movements, directing his soldiers to reposition while the YRRKX were blinded by dust storms. The turning point came when James led a counteroffensive that defied all logic. He identified a weak point in the YRRKX formation and orchestrated a feint that lured them into a natural ravine. Zoktar's unit, positioned above, rained fire upon the trapped enemy, decimating their ranks. It was a maneuver so audacious that Zoktar wouldn't have believed it possible had he not seen it with his own eyes. What struck Zoktar most was not just James's ingenuity but his composure. Even in the heat of battle, the human remained focused and deliberate. Where others might have faltered, James thrived, adapting to every twist and turn of the conflict with an ease that seemed almost unnatural. When the dust finally settled, the battlefield was unrecognizable. The YRRKX forces had been routed, their siege broken. Zoktar's unit, battered but alive, stood in stunned silence. They turned to James, who was already tending to the wounded, his face betraying no hint of triumph or pride. For the first time in his long career, Zoktar found himself at a loss for words. This human, this fragile creature from a Deathworld, had achieved what he had thought impossible. And he had done it not through brute force, but through a combination of intelligence, adaptability, and an unshakable will. Zoktar realized then that he had underestimated not just James, but humanity itself. The tales of Deathworlders were not myths or exaggerations. They were truths born from a reality Zoktar could scarcely comprehend. As he watched James move among the survivors, offering words of encouragement and quiet reassurances, Zoktar felt a deep respect take root within him, a respect that would forever change the way he saw the universe. The battlefield had fallen silent, the echoes of destruction replaced by the uneasy stillness of survival. Zoktar's soldiers were alive, though battered and disoriented, their eyes darting between the smoldering wreckage and the human who had made their survival possible. Lieutenant James stood apart from the group, quietly inspecting the terrain, his movements deliberate and measured. For Zoktar, the victory was a bitter brew of triumph and discomfort. Gratitude for their survival clashed with an unsettling sense of inadequacy. This fragile Deathworlder had turned the tide where his years of experience had faltered. He could see the same conflict mirrored in the eyes of his soldiers. They owed their lives to a being they had underestimated from the start. James approached, his expression calm but his voice firm. "We need to secure this area and tend to the wounded. Rest later, work now." It wasn't an order barked from authority, it was a statement imbued with certainty. Without hesitation, the aliens followed his lead, their movements mechanical at first, then purposeful as James's steady demeanor restored a semblance of order. Later that evening, under the faint light of an alien moon, they gathered around a makeshift fire. The tension, though muted, lingered like a specter among them. Zoktar watched James with cautious curiosity, wondering what drove this strange creature who thrived where others would have crumbled. As if sensing the unspoken questions, James broke the silence. "You're wondering how we do it, aren't you?" His tone wasn't boastful, it was reflective, almost introspective. Zoktar nodded, his pride yielding to genuine curiosity. "You act as if nothing phases you. As if fear is a stranger." James chuckled, the sound unexpectedly warm. "Fear? We know fear better than most. But we've learned to live with it, even harness it. Earth isn't a place that allows weakness. It's a constant struggle, against nature, against each other, against ourselves." He gestured toward the sky, as if pointing to the stars that connected their worlds. "Humans are what we are because of what we've endured. Floods, earthquakes, famines, our planet throws everything at us, and we adapt. We don't always win, but we don't stop trying." The aliens listened intently, their skepticism giving way to fascination. James's words painted a picture of a world that sounded more like a proving ground than a home. "We've had wars that lasted generations," he continued, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Diseases that wiped out millions. But we rebuild. We learn. We grow stronger, not because we're the smartest or the toughest, but because we refuse to quit. Hope, it's what keeps us moving forward, even when it feels impossible." Zoktar found himself leaning closer, drawn not just to the words but to the conviction behind them. It wasn't arrogance or bravado, it was a quiet, unyielding belief in something greater. "Where does that hope come from?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. James shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible smile crossing his lips. "Maybe it's stubbornness. Maybe it's the understanding that life, no matter how hard, is worth fighting for. And maybe it's the knowledge that even in our darkest moments, we're not alone. We fight for each other." The group fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a heavy blanket. For beings who had lived their lives in structured hierarchies and rigid societal roles, the concept of such raw, collective determination was both alien and inspiring. As the night deepened, James's presence began to feel less like an anomaly and more like a bridge. He didn't speak down to them or command their respect through fear. Instead, he treated them as equals, sharing stories of Earth and asking about their own worlds in return. His curiosity was genuine, his questions probing but respectful. Zoktar watched as his soldiers, once wary and aloof, opened up to the human. They shared tales of their homes, their struggles, their fears. And James listened, not out of obligation, but out of an earnest desire to understand. It was a strange, almost surreal sight. The barriers between species, forged by millennia of war and distrust, seemed to dissolve in James's presence. The laughter around the fire grew lighter, the stories more personal. Bonds were forming, not through shared bloodlines or cultural ties, but through mutual respect and shared vulnerability. Zoktar found himself speaking as well, recounting his own tales of hardship and loss. James listened just as intently to him as he had to the others. It was a humbling experience, to be seen not as a warrior or a leader, but simply as a being with a story worth telling. In those quiet moments, Zoktar understood what made humans unique. It wasn't their resilience or their ingenuity, though those traits were undeniable. It was their ability to connect, to forge relationships that transcended differences and turned strangers into allies. Humanity's strength wasn't just in their survival, it was in their capacity to bring others into their fold, to make them believe in something greater than themselves. As the fire began to die down, Zoktar felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for their survival, but for the lessons James had imparted. The human had shown them that strength wasn't about dominance or invincibility. It was about the willingness to endure, to adapt, and to stand together in the face of adversity. And in that moment, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Zoktar realized that he no longer saw James as an outsider. He saw him as something far more meaningful, a comrade. The group had barely begun their retreat when disaster struck. The calm following their earlier victory proved deceptive, shattered by the sudden roar of engines and the unrelenting march of a larger enemy force. Zoktar's unit froze as the sheer scale of the ambush became apparent. YRRKX soldiers poured over the ridges, their numbers overwhelming. Their weapons lit up the sky, casting eerie shadows over the rocky terrain. Panic rippled through the group. The soldiers, already weary and wounded, found their morale crumbling under the weight of what seemed an impossible challenge. Even Zoktar, hardened by years of warfare, felt the gnawing edge of despair. Amidst the chaos, James stepped forward. His voice cut through the din like a blade, sharp and commanding. "We're not finished yet," he said, his tone steady despite the towering odds. His eyes burned with a determination that seemed to defy reason. Zoktar studied the human, torn between disbelief and admiration. Even in the face of certain death, James exuded a confidence that was almost infectious. The soldiers, though hesitant, quieted, their focus shifting from the enemy to the human who had already saved them once. James moved quickly, surveying their surroundings with a critical eye. His mind seemed to work faster than the unfolding chaos, piecing together a strategy from the jagged pieces of their predicament. The terrain offered little comfort, barren rock and treacherous slopes, but James's expression changed as an idea sparked. "This canyon," he said, pointing toward a narrow pass flanked by unstable cliffs. "It's a death trap for them if we use it right." The aliens exchanged skeptical glances, but James pressed on. "We lure them in. Force them to funnel through the pass. The rocks are loose, a well-timed strike could bury them." "It's a gamble," Zoktar said, his voice tinged with doubt. "And what if it fails?" James locked eyes with him, unwavering. "Then we go down fighting. But we'll make them pay for every step." The logic was brutal but sound, and there was no time to argue. Zoktar gave the order, and the soldiers moved into position under James's direction. The plan required precision and nerve. James led a small team to act as bait, drawing the enemy into the canyon with calculated movements and carefully timed strikes. He anticipated their reactions, using feints and diversions to manipulate their advance. As the YRRKX surged into the canyon, the rest of the unit lay in wait above. James had instructed them to target key points along the cliffs, where the rocks were most unstable. Timing was everything. Too early, and the enemy could regroup. Too late, and the trap would be for nothing. The tension was suffocating as the enemy filled the narrow pass, their forces bottlenecked by the terrain. James signaled the others, his movements crisp and deliberate despite the chaos around him. At the precise moment, Zoktar and his soldiers unleashed a barrage of firepower, striking the weakened cliff edges. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The rocks groaned and shifted before cascading down in a thunderous avalanche. The YRRKX, caught in the trap, had no time to react. The canyon became a tomb, burying the majority of their forces under tons of rubble. Cheers erupted among the alien soldiers, their despair transformed into elation. But the victory was not without cost. In ensuring the trap's success, James had remained dangerously close to the collapse zone. A falling boulder struck him as he dove for cover, sending him sprawling. Zoktar was the first to reach him, his massive hands carefully turning the human onto his back. James's face was pale, his breath shallow, but his eyes remained sharp despite the pain. Did we get them? He rasped, his voice strained but still laced with determination. Zoktar nodded, his respect for the human deepening with every passing moment. You did more than that. You saved us all. Even as James slipped into unconsciousness, the impact of his actions resonated among the survivors. He had not only turned the tide of battle but had shown Zoktar and his soldiers what it meant to face overwhelming odds with courage and ingenuity. In that moment, Zoktar understood that humanity's greatest strength was not their resilience alone, it was their willingness to put everything on the line for the sake of others. Zoktar paused, his gaze sweeping over the circle of young alien soldiers seated around the campfire. Their faces reflected a mixture of awe and contemplation, the flames casting flickering shadows that mirrored the turmoil within their minds. He allowed the silence to stretch, giving weight to his next words. I used to think humans were reckless, Zoktar admitted, his voice uncharacteristically soft. I thought their stubbornness was foolish, their tenacity born of desperation rather than strength. Meeting James forced me to confront how little I understood them. He wasn't just a soldier fighting to survive, he was a force, a spark that ignited something greater in all of us. The veteran's leathery hand rested on his knee as he leaned closer to the fire, the light accentuating the deep lines etched into his face by years of battle. Humans are more than survivors of a death world. They are catalysts for hope, for change. James taught me that survival isn't enough. It's what you do with that survival, how you inspire others, how you refuse to let fear dictate your actions, that truly defines you. The soldiers around him shifted, the weight of Zoktar's words pressing against their chests. For beings who had spent their lives measuring worth through physical strength and tactical superiority, the revelation was almost unsettling. One of the younger soldiers, his carapace glinting in the firelight, spoke up hesitantly. So, humans, they're not invincible. But they act as if they are? Zoktar's lips curled into a faint smile. Not invincible. Just relentless. And that relentlessness is what makes them dangerous and inspiring. They fail, they bleed, they fall. But they always rise again. That's what makes them different. That's what makes them extraordinary. The group fell silent again, the crackle of the fire filling the void. The soldiers began murmuring among themselves, their initial skepticism giving way to a burgeoning admiration. They create bonds so easily, another soldier mused. That unity, it's not something we're used to. We fight for our clans, our honor. But humans fight for everyone around them. And that's their strength, Zoktar affirmed. It's not just their ingenuity or adaptability. It's their spirit, their ability to inspire others to stand and fight, even when the odds are impossible. James didn't just save us. He made us believe in ourselves, in each other. That's something no training or technology can replicate. The youngest soldier, barely old enough to be on the battlefield, spoke in a tone of reverence. It's strange to think that such a fragile-looking species could be so unstoppable. Zoktar chuckled, his voice carrying a trace of pride. Fragile, yes. But never underestimate a Deathworlder. Their world forged them in fire, and that fire burns in everything they do. The older warrior shifted, his gaze growing distant as he continued. James survived that day, though just barely. The injuries he sustained would have ended any of us, but he pushed through. When he recovered, he didn't stop. He returned to the front lines, not because he was ordered to, but because he believed he could still make a difference. Zoktar's voice dropped, carrying the weight of a truth he had come to understand over time. Humans don't fight because they have to. They fight because they choose to. For their comrades, for the chance at a better future. That's a strength that no enemy can predict or prepare for. The soldiers leaned in, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and reverence. What happened to him? One of them asked, the question almost a whisper. James became a legend, Zoktar said simply. Not because he was invincible, but because he inspired others to believe in the impossible. He showed them what it meant to fight not just for survival, but for hope. Even among my own people, his name is spoken with respect. And among humans, He paused, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Well, they'd probably just call him another Deathworlder. The group chuckled nervously, the tension easing but the weight of the story lingering. Zokhtar's expression grew serious as he delivered his final words. Remember this, all of you, never underestimate a Deathworlder. They may look fragile. They may seem reckless. But they carry within them the fury of their world and the unyielding will to survive. To face a human is to face the full force of what it means to defy the impossible. The flames danced higher for a moment, casting long shadows across the group as Zokhtar leaned back, his tale complete. The soldiers sat in contemplative silence, the lessons of the story taking root in their minds. And as the fire burned low, one question hung unspoken in the air, echoing in their thoughts like a distant drumbeat: if this is what one human could do, what else might their kind be capable of?